The airport was alive with the usual chaos, people rushing past announcements echoing overhead and the rhythmic clatter of rolling suitcases on tile floors. In the middle of it all, Gate 24 was packed with travelers waiting to board a flight to Dallas. Among them was a woman in her late 40s, impeccably dressed in a navy blazer and heels that clicked sharply as she moved. Her expression was one of quiet superiority, scanning the first-class line as though assessing who belonged there and who didn't. That's when she saw him. A young man, no older than 16, standing confidently in the line. His outfit was casual jeans, a hoodie, and a bright red hat that made her eyes narrow. MAGA, the 4 letters embroidered on the cap, seemed to ignite something within her. She glanced at him again, her jaw tightening as she muttered under her breath, "Unbelievable." He didn't seem to notice her yet, his attention on his phone occasionally glancing at the gate agent who was busy preparing for boarding, but she wasn't about to let this slide. Her indignation grew as she imagined the audacity of someone like him wearing that hat. In first class, her thoughts ran wild. Was he even old enough to pay for that ticket? Did he think the hat would give him some kind of free pass? The boarding announcement crackled over the speakers and the young man began to move forward, his ticket in hand. But as he approached the gate, the woman stepped closer, her heels clicking loudly on the floor. She wasn't going to keep her thoughts to herself for long, but before the line started moving, her reaction was about to spark a scene that no one at Gate 24 would forget. The woman didn't waste any time. As the young man stepped toward the gate agent, she angled herself in front of him, blocking his path. Her polished demeanor was now tinged with irritation as she spoke loudly enough for those nearby to hear. "Excuse me," she said, her tone dripping with condescension. "I think you might be in the wrong line." The young man blinked, momentarily confused. He looked around, then back at her. "No, this is first class," he replied, simply holding up his boarding pass. Her eyes narrowed as she took in the bold red hat perched on his head. "First class," she repeated with a skeptical laugh. "You're telling me you bought a first-class ticket?" Her voice carried enough to catch the attention of others in the line. A few people turned their heads, their curiosity piqued. The young man stayed calm, though there was a slight crease in his brow. "Now, yes, ma'am," he said, his tone polite but firm. "Is there a problem?" The woman crossed her arms, her voice sharpening. "Look, I don't know who you think you are, but first class is for people who, well, let's just say it's for people who belong there." She gestured at his hat. "And I'm not sure someone with that attitude belongs here." The young man tilted his head, his lips pressing into a thin line. He didn't say anything at first, but the silence only seemed to embolden her. "You know," she continued, her voice rising slightly, "there are plenty of seats back in economy where you'd probably feel more comfortable by now." More heads had turned, and a murmur began to ripple through the crowd. The gate agent glanced up from her screen, her expression shifting to one of concern. But instead of shrinking away, the young man squared his shoulders, ready to respond in a way that no one expected. The young man drew a slow breath, his calm composure unwavering. He looked the woman directly in the eye, his voice steady. "Ma'am, I'm just here to board my flight like everyone else. My ticket's valid, and I don't think it's anyone's business where I sit." His words, simple yet resolute, only seemed to fuel her indignation. She let out a scoff and turned to the people around them as if seeking validation. "Can you believe this?" she said, gesturing toward him. "First class used to mean something now. Apparently, anyone can just—" "That's enough," interrupted a voice from the gate. The gate agent, a middle-aged woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, had stepped out from behind her desk. She crossed her arms, her gaze sharp. "Is there a problem here?" The woman turned toward her, her tone switching to faux innocence. "I'm just saying, I think it's a little suspicious that someone like him," she paused, glancing at the young man again, "is in this line. I mean, look at him." The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, some people shaking their heads, others whispering to one another. A man in a business suit muttered, "What's her problem?" While a younger woman holding a toddler glared at the woman with visible disapproval. The gate agent raised a hand to quiet the crowd. "Let me see your boarding pass, sir," she said to the young man. He handed it over without hesitation. She scanned it, glanced at her screen, and nodded. "Mr. Barron Trump, first class. Everything checks out." A wave of silence washed over the onlookers. The name hung in the air like an unspoken truth, and all eyes snapped back to the young man. He stood there unfazed as if he'd been through this kind of scrutiny before. The woman blinked, her mouth opening and closing as if searching for words. "Wait, you're—" He nodded. "Yes, ma'am. That's my name." The crowd's murmurs turned to hushed exclamations. People began pulling out their phones, some snapping pictures, others quickly Googling his name. The tension in the air had shifted, but the woman's indignation hadn't entirely melted away. But the moment wasn't over yet, and Barron's next words were about to change everything. Barron Trump didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His words were calm, deliberate, and carried a weight that made everyone lean in just a little closer. "You know." He began looking directly at the woman. "My dad always told me to treat people with respect even when they don't show it back, because how you act says more about you than it does about anyone else." The woman's face flushed a deep red. She opened her mouth to respond, but Barron wasn't finished. "You judged me without knowing anything about me. All you saw was a hat. But here's the thing, that hat doesn't define me, just like your words today don't have to define you." The crowd was riveted. Conversation stopped, and even the gate agent froze mid-step, her hand still hovering near the boarding scanner. Barron took a small step forward, his voice softening but still carrying across the space. "I didn't choose to be in the position I'm in, but I do get to choose how I act. And right now, I'm choosing not to argue with you because there's enough fighting in the world." Don't you think the woman stood there stunned? It was clear she hadn't expected to be addressed with such grace and dignity by someone she'd tried to humiliate. "I hope your day gets better." Barron added, his tone sincere. "And I hope you'll think twice before you make someone else feel small." There was a collective exhale from the crowd. A few people clapped softly, and the man in the business suit gave a low whistle. Someone muttered, "Well, that was something," and others nodded in agreement. But as Barron moved forward to board the plane, the ripple effect of his words was just beginning. The woman stood frozen, her earlier confidence evaporating as the reality of the situation sank in. She looked around, hoping for support, but the faces surrounding her told a different story. Some were sympathetic, others disappointed, and a few openly critical. "You know, you really owe him an apology," said the young mother holding her toddler, her voice calm but firm. The woman's gaze dropped, her mouth twitching as if she wanted to respond, but no words came. Barron had already disappeared down the jet bridge. His red hat still visible as he walked away. The crowd began to shift, people returning to their own concerns, but the atmosphere felt different, heavier, more reflective. The woman's shoulders sagged, and she turned back toward the gate agent, who was now checking tickets again. I just thought the gate agent didn't look up, her expression impassive as she scanned the next passenger's boarding pass. "Maybe think a little more before you speak." "Next time," she said quietly, her tone devoid of judgment but not without meaning. The woman sighed and stepped aside, moving to the back of the line. Her earlier indignation had turned into something far more uncomfortable regret. She replayed the moment in her mind, hearing Barron's calm words again and again. He hadn't lashed out, hadn't matched her hostility, and somehow that made her feel worse. As she glanced around the terminal, she caught snippets of conversations. "Can you believe he kept his cool like that?" Someone said, "I would have lost it if I were him," added another. But it wasn't just the young man's composure that lingered in her thoughts. It was the simple truth of what he'd said. The way she'd acted really did say more about her than it did about him. But the lesson she was beginning to grasp was something the entire terminal would take with them. Long after the flight departed, the terminal gradually settled back into its usual rhythm, but the energy around Gate 24 remained different strangers who had once been engrossed in their own lives, now exchanged knowing glances, quiet conversations springing up about what had just unfolded. The young mother, still holding her sleepy toddler, leaned over to the man in the business suit. "You don't see that kind of restraint often, especially from someone his age," she said. He nodded thoughtfully, his face contemplative. "It's rare these days, isn't it? Someone standing up for themselves without tearing someone else down." A few seats away, an older woman turned to her companion. "I feel for her," though she said softly, referring to the woman who had caused the scene. "It takes courage to admit when you've been wrong, and I think she's starting to realize it." The woman herself sat quietly at the back of the boarding line. Now her head down, lost in thought, she was still grappling with what had happened, but deep down she knew she had been wrong. What surprised her most wasn't the embarrassment of being called out. It was the grace with which the young man had handled it. He could have humiliated her, could have thrown her words back in her face, but instead he had chosen to de-escalate. His restraint was something she hadn't expected, and it gnawed at her conscience nearby. Two teenagers whispered excitedly, phones in hand. "Did you see the way he spoke to her? It's all over TikTok already." One of them said, showing her screen to the other. "Yeah, but it wasn't just what he said, it's how he said it, like calm but strong." "You know," replied the other. The woman overheard them, her cheeks burning again, but this time the heat wasn't just embarrassment, it was the beginning of realization. She had allowed her assumptions to cloud her judgment, and now she was the one being judged, but what she hadn't realized yet was how that brief encounter was already sparking a larger conversation far beyond Gate 24. As the flight prepared for departure, the woman finally boarded her head low as she passed through the first-class cabin. There he was seated by the window, the red hat resting on the tray table in front of him. Barron didn't look up, seemingly engrossed in a book, but as she walked by, she hesitated the words she'd been rehearsing. Catching in her throat, she stopped, turning slightly toward him. "Excuse me," she said softly. He glanced up, his expression neutral but not unkind. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry. I shouldn't have assumed anything about you that was wrong of me." Barron studied her for a moment before nodding. Slightly, apology accepted. He said simply, his tone as calm as it had been earlier. She lingered for a moment, unsure if she should say more, but his gaze had already shifted back to his book. Taking the cue, she moved on to her seat, her heart feeling both lighter and heavier. At once the flight attendants completed their final checks and the plane taxied toward the runway. Passengers settled in, but the atmosphere carried the remnants of what had happened back at the gate. Conversations about respect, assumptions, and composure buzzed quietly among the rows. Meanwhile, Barron leaned back in his seat, his book open but unread. His mind replayed the moment, not out of pride, but reflection. He had spent much of his life navigating situations like this, being judged, scrutinized, even. Dismissed it never got easier, but his father's advice always stayed with him. Rise above, always rise above. He looked out the window as the plane lifted off, wondering if the woman truly understood the lesson. She had learned today, more importantly. He hoped the others who had witnessed the exchange would carry it with them too, because sometimes it's the smallest interactions that remind us how powerful our words and actions can be. The flight cruised steadily at 35,000 feet. The cabin lights dimmed as passengers settled into their seats. The woman sat quietly staring out the window, but seeing more of her reflection than the sky beyond. Barron's words echoed in her mind, not as a rebuke, but as a mirror. They revealed truths about her that she hadn't been ready to face elsewhere in the plane. Others reflected too. The man in the business suit scrolled through emails but found himself pausing, thinking about how often he jumped to conclusions in his own life. The young mother smiled softly at her sleeping child, grateful for the reminder to raise him with kindness and respect as the plane began its descent into Dallas. An unspoken understanding seemed to ripple through the cabin that day at Gate 24. Something meaningful had unfolded for Barron. It was just another flight, another moment to rise above assumptions and hold on to the values instilled in him. For the woman, it was a turning point, a humbling experience that she knew would stay with her. And for everyone else who had been there, it was a story, a reminder of the importance of grace, humility, and the courage to see beyond appearances. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to reflect on your own actions. How often do we judge without knowing the full story? Let's strive to be better, not just for ourselves, but for those around us. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories that inspire, challenge, and remind us of the impact of kindness and understanding.